I had been a train conductor for over 15 years, and in that time, I had seen my fair share of odd occurrences. Late-night shifts were particularly eerie, with the tracks stretching out into the darkness and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels providing a haunting soundtrack. But nothing could have prepared me for the terror that awaited on the Midnight Express. It started as a regular night. I checked the passenger list, ensuring everyone was accounted for before signaling the departure. The train pulled out of the station, the engine's roar fading into the steady hum of motion. The midnight route was usually quiet, with only a handful of passengers traveling between small towns. About an hour into the journey, I began my routine check through the carriages. The first few were nearly empty, with only a couple of travelers dozing in their seats. As I reached the third carriage, I noticed something unusual. A woman in a vintage dress sat alone by the window, her face partially obscured by a lace veil. "Evening, ma'am," I greeted her, but she did not respond. She continued to stare out the window, her body unnaturally still. I shrugged it off, assuming she was asleep, and continued my rounds. The fourth carriage was empty, as expected. I turned back, intending to finish my inspection. As I passed through the third carriage again, the woman was gone. Confused, I looked around, but there was no sign of her. I checked the restrooms and other compartments, but she had vanished. The unease settled in the pit of my stomach, but I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she had moved to another carriage while I wasn't looking. Returning to my post, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The train's lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through the corridor. Later that night, as we approached a remote stretch of track, I heard a faint whispering. It was coming from the direction of the third carriage. I hesitated, but decided to investigate. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath misted in the air, and the whispering grew louder. I followed the sound to the seat where the woman had been sitting. There, on the window, was a handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass from the outside. My heart pounded as I backed away, only to feel a sudden gust of wind rush past me. The next night, the apparitions began. I saw shadowy figures moving through the carriages, always just at the edge of my vision. They flickered like old film reels, their faces blurred and indistinct. Passengers reported strange occurrences, luggage moving on its own, cold spots and whispers in the dark. One evening, as we passed through a desolate area, the lights went out completely. The train shuddered to a halt, and I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Turning, I saw the woman in the vintage dress. Her eyes were hollow and her mouth twisted into a silent scream. I stumbled back, and she vanished. The lights flickered back on, and the train resumed its journey as if nothing had happened. The other passengers were oblivious to the horrors unfolding around them. Desperate for answers, I delved into the train's history. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. Decades ago, there had been a tragic accident on this very route. A collision with another train had resulted in numerous deaths. Among the victims was a woman in a vintage dress, traveling to reunite with her fiancé. Her body was never found. As the nights went on, the hauntings grew more intense. The apparitions became more aggressive, appearing right in front of me, their faces contorted in anguish. The woman in the vintage dress was always there, her hollow eyes fixed on me. One night, the train came to a sudden stop in the middle of nowhere. I checked the controls, but everything seemed fine. Stepping outside, I was enveloped in an unnatural fog. Shadows flitted through the mist, and I heard distant screams. I turned back to the train, but the door was locked. The windows were filled with ghostly faces, all staring at me with pleading eyes. The woman in the vintage dress appeared beside me, her hand reaching out. "Help us," she whispered, her voice echoing with despair. Gathering my courage, I asked, "How? What do you want?" "Find our remains. Give us peace," she replied before dissolving into the mist. Determined to end the haunting, I began investigating the site of the accident. With the help of local historians, I located the crash site, now overgrown and forgotten. Digging through the wreckage, I uncovered the remains of the missing passengers, including the woman in the vintage dress. With the authorities' help, we arranged a proper burial for the victims. As the final rites were performed, the air grew still, and a sense of calm settled over the area. That night, the Midnight Express ran without incident for the first time in weeks. The apparitions never returned, and the eerie occurrences ceased. The train's history was finally at rest, and I resumed my duties with a newfound respect for the past. But I will never forget the haunted faces and the chilling encounters on the Phantom train. To this day, whenever I pass that stretch of track, I can't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see the woman in the vintage dress finally at peace. The memory of those nights remains etched in my mind, a reminder that some spirits linger until they find closure.